We're joined by Professor Jarpa Dawuni from Howard University to talk about this historic moment. A very good evening to you on our side, morning, afternoon on your end. Thank you so much for speaking to us. I mean, this whole issue, as we mentioned, lies with the underrepresentation of black women and people of color, them serving as judges. That's remained so low for nearly 232 years since the creation of the federal judiciary. So let's talk about the necessity of black women being at the table of justice, being representative. Only scratches the surface, though. Why is that?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And indeed, it's a really historic moment for those of us in particular who study gender and judging and women in judiciaries. It's a really important moment for us as we look at the United States as the world's leading democracy. And that for so many years, over 200 years, the judiciary within the United States has not been fully representative in terms of different identities, including gender and race. So Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's confirmation is historic for many reasons. One, that it looks at the issue of the underrepresentation of racial minorities within the judicial system in the United States, but most importantly also the underrepresentation of women. And so Justice Brown Jackson stands at the intersection of gender and race, and of course other identities that she embodies. So we are all hopeful that this confirmation and appointment will be the beginning of changes within the United States judiciary, which will have a trickle effect on other judiciaries globally.
I mean, one U.S. senator called the eventual nominee an affirmative action beneficiary, a Georgetown law professor, accusing her of being a lesser black woman. And I'm just wondering, how do you change such mindsets and thinking that qualified people have a right not only to be appointed, but they are meritorious?
Yeah, indeed, there's been a lot of research done within the field of gender and judging by different scholars around the world. Myself, I have co-edited 3 books in this area and working in on other books. And there are many scholars across South Africa as well who have worked on this topic, including Professor Penelope Andrews, Dr. Tabet Masengu, and others. And we realized that when it comes to issues of women in leadership positions, not just within the judiciary, women have that extra burden. Some will call it a double jeopardy. Some will call it a triple jeopardy, that women have to assert their merits on grounds which are often not based on gender inclusive standards. And so when women have to fight that battle, and then in addition to that, imagine being a black woman or other racial minority woman, you have the added burden of proving yourself. So systemic historical racism creates a double or triple jeopardy for black women in particular. And I'll end on this note. The record is clear that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson is one of the most qualified women and judges within the United States. But of course, her confirmation showed us very clearly that when it comes to the judicialization of politics, we have these issues coming up. And when it comes to the racialization of judiciaries, then we have this added burden that women have to face, as did Justice Brown Jackson.
And we'll look at the structures from which there have been including the laws that have been written that disadvantages women, especially women of color, in just a moment. But I want to look at the behind the scenes and how she eventually came to be elected. So just 3 Republicans joined the Democratic majority in the vote to confirm Judge Jackson, and President Biden had a special word of thanks for the 3 GOP senators who broke with their caucus. Let's take a listen and watch.
I always believed that the bipartisan vote was possible, and I hope I don't get him in trouble. I mean it sincerely, but I want to thank 3 Republicans who voted for Judge Jackson. Senator Collins, who's a woman of integrity. Senator Murkowski, the same way, an Alaskan, up for re-election. And Mitt Romney, whose dad stood up like he did. His dad stood up and made these decisions on civil rights. They deserve enormous credit for setting aside partisanship and making a carefully considered judgment based on the judge's character, qualifications, independence. And I truly admire the respect, diligence, and hard work they demonstrated in the course of the process. As someone who's overseen, they tell me, more Supreme Court nominations than anyone who's alive today, I believe that respect for the process is important. And that's why it was so important to me to meet the constitutional requirement to seek the advice and the consent of the Senate.
So, I mean, let's first, before we talk about what she herself has had to say, look at what is expected her. How do judges focus on ensuring that they are willing to represent the values and perspectives of minority communities and are represented on the bench while keeping to the letter of the law? Because the criticisms some have laid her way, and it's a question of what is her duty and what isn't, and where her consciousness, her values, her virtues should shine.
Yeah, I think we often tend to think or maybe assume that judges are not human. They are first human and then they are judges. And in as much as judges all hold their oath of office to be impartial and unbiased, there are also certain lived experiences that they may bring to the bench that help them to understand the lived realities of other groups of people. Now, it's often been easy for people to say, well, why a woman? Why a Black? Why a Mexican? Why, a gay person? And we often don't ask the question, why the male? Why the white male? Why the Ivy League male? And so as the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, why not 9? Why not 9 women on the Supreme Court of the United States? And so we're having to constantly, or women are having to constantly explain themselves why they should be at a table. But we know that historically, men don't often tend to do that. So it's important for us to remember that part of the process of getting judges onto the court, whichever court it is, if we can bring it to be impartial and neutral and unbiased, then we won't have to deal with these questions of whether the candidate will go one way or the other. And so it's also part of the selectors to be as impartial as they should be in order to guarantee that we don't politicize judicial positions as we saw happen in this case and many other cases before this one.
Right. So she herself, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, paid tribute to those who had come before her to make this historic moment possible. Let's take a listen.
I have now achieved something far beyond anything my grandparents could have possibly ever imagined. But no one does this on their own. The path was cleared for me so that I might rise to this occasion. And in the poetic words of Dr. Maya Angelou, I do so now while bringing the gifts my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. So as I take on this new role, I strongly believe that this is a moment in which all Americans can take great pride. We have come a long way toward perfecting our union. In my family, it took just one generation to go from segregation to the Supreme Court of the United States. And it is an honor, the honor of a lifetime, for me to have this chance to join the court, to promote the rule of law at the highest level, and to do my part to carry our shared project of democracy and equal justice under law forward into the future.
So I want us, Professor Dawuni, to trace back what she's been referring to. You referred to Ruth Bader Ginsburg earlier on. We know what a tough struggle it was. The people that came before her, we know that black men, white women, entered this fray far before they did. But in 1939, it was Jane Matilda Bolin who became the first black woman appointed as a judge in New York. What was her contribution in trailing a blaze for people like Ketanji Jackson?
Yeah, I haven't studied her, and I must say that I have a book about her on my bookshelf, which I keep piling the books. So I haven't looked at her specifically, but just tracing the historic, talking about 1939, and many others who have come between then, between her. I am at Howard University. We have a law school that has produced some of the best and the brightest to the judicial system in the United States, including the first black male Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And so I think that what is happening over time is that there is a shift that's happening, even though it may be happening slower than we would like to see. And so for people like Justice Bolin, open the door, and with everything to do with struggle, human struggle, civil rights, human rights, is that when there's a door open, there's always the backlash, and there are always things that are being done to close that door or to close it tighter. But what we have heard from Justice Brown Jackson herself is that many people continue to fight for those rights, those equal opportunities. And so as the struggle continues to ensure that there is indeed diversity in the judicial system, each win, each success will be leading, hopefully, to a brighter future for justice, equity, and inclusion in the United States and around the world.
And in an era where obviously Black Lives Matter, that is a very important departure point to be looking at these issues. I mean, for instance, I think it was Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley who says those closest to the pain must be closest to the power, which I think is a very important thing. Kenyora Parnham saying that in many cases, laws were explicitly written so that black women's bodies could be exploited and abused without consequence. Do you share this view? And how does somebody like Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson maneuver, not only just in terms of the challenges she faces, but to bring into sharp focus these challenges that particularly women of color, people of color face?
That's so true. I mean, we all have heard about the term intersectionality, which is really something that is changing the ways in which we analyze feminist discourse within the United States and globally. And that idea of intersectionality is really what you have mentioned, that the Black body, women's bodies, and women's issues have always been at the intersection of many challenges that they have to constantly overcome. And it's interesting you talk about this because I'm teaching a course this semester on women, gender, and sexualities in comparative perspectives to my class at Howard University as part of the minor for women, gender, and sexuality studies. And just this week, I had a guest lecture who Dr. Nadia Brown, who has a co-authored book, talks about sister appearance, but she looks at women in legislatures in the United States and how the appearance of Black women can have different impacts on whether they run for office, if they win, and what perceptions people have about them. And she mentions the important aspect of the politicization of the Black woman's body, what she wears. We know that women have to face those, but for a Black woman in particular, it's also about the hair and whether she's wearing a hijab and other ways in which she represents herself. And Dr. Nadia Brown in her book mentioned this during her presentation of the historic experience of Black women in the United States who were branded, their hairs were branded, or their scalp were branded by their slave owners just so the hair wouldn't grow. And sometimes they would mark those places so that the hair will grow in patches. And she used that as an example of how the Black body, Black women's bodies were constantly being reconfigured and owned, and how the perceptions of what constituted beauty and even femininity were being identity or were being put on them by the slave owners. So it's a historic process that Black women in the United States have constantly have to fight, even for their body rights. And of course, there are many laws that have been written to write out their rights in many other ways.
Professor Dawuni, just to quickly wrap up, and as you've mentioned, those important works of yours, unveiled narratives and from obscurity to parity, I want to look at the global picture now. Your primary areas of research do include, as you mentioned, judicial politics, women in legal professions, gender and the law. But I want to focus on international human rights, particularly women in civil society organizing. How can they drive democratization projects further at a larger scale, given our demographic weight as women globally?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about women's civil society organizing, and once again, I look at the continent of Africa as an example, is that we always tend to think that women are now coming into being or into themselves, but we need to constantly remind ourselves of the historic past. And I know that for some people, it sounds like we are romanticizing the past, but we are not. In Ghana, I come from Ghana originally, and there's a system, there's a word that means, let's say, sankofa or sankofa, some people will call it. It's a medical bed. Assumption that we need to look back to history to move forward. So I think when we're talking about women's civil society organizing, which was what my dissertation was on, that it's important for us to ground women's feminist movements within Africa from an African matriarchal system that historically showed women leading wars and women leading armies. And that should be an important way we ground ourselves and not fall into this kind of dependency cycle of looking out to the other parts of the world for them to come save us. Women can save ourselves in Africa. And if we do that, we hopefully will be able to push it forward. And of course, we exist in a global system. And so we need a global support. But on our own, we have always been fighters and we can do it. And I hope that these struggles, as we are seeing currently in many other parts of the continent, in Nigeria, will lead to women's rights being realized.
It's such a pity we have run out of time, but really do appreciate your time and your insights. So much appreciated. Professor Jarpa Dawuni from Howard University speaking about that historic woman of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson being appointed the first Black woman to the highest court in the U.S. nation, the Supreme Court.